But are black voters buying this Trumpian history remix? Well, in the latest McClatchy Mayor's poll, two-way poll, only 3% of African Americans said that they would vote for Trump. Mark Thompson is still with me, and joining me now is Jimmy Williams, host of the podcast Decode DC, and a former top aide to Senate Democratic Whip Dick Durbin, and Leah Wright-Rigueur from the Harvard Kennedy School and anti-racism educator Tim Wise. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to go to you first, Tim, because you have the disadvantage of not being here with us at the table. When Donald Trump says that it has never been worse for African Americans, do you read this as empathy for things like, say, the killings of black men by police, the situation that Black Lives Matter is protesting, or do you read it as something else?
Well, I think he is right-wing virtue signaling to his base. I mean, he is trying to remind his base just how dysfunctional and pathological they already believe black people are. So in that sense, he's not trying to reach out to suburban whites and convince them that I'm not really racist, you can vote for me. What he's doing is saying, remember how bad those people are. That's why we need stop and frisk. That's why we need to control them with law and order. This is all very much about signaling to that base, reminding them that he views the black community just as they do. And of course, his view is entirely wrong. The reality is violent crime is down by about 40% since 25 to 30 years ago. Interestingly, the black male homicide rate in this country, the per capita rate of homicide for black men, is lower today than it was in 1950, let alone 30 years ago. But people like Donald Trump make bank politically off of telling white folks how decrepit and dysfunctional black people are so as to stoke the racial resentment that the politics of prejudice rely upon.
And Leah, this does feel in a lot of ways kind of like the Nixon campaign. This sort of feels very Nixonian. I want to play Donald Trump talking about stop and frisk that Tim just mentioned and get your reaction on the other side.
The Trump campaign has an epidemic of profound ignorance and stupidity. And that's what she represents. That's what he represents. Even to say stop and frisk was a good thing, when the numbers show it failed miserably. Right. And most of those who were found with contraband on their person were the white kids, not the black kids, even though black kids were arrested at twice the rate. When he's speaking, he's not speaking to African Americans. That's not who he's talking to. He's orange man speaking with forked tongue. He's trying to appeal to moderate whites, moderate conservatives, to pretend as if he cares for the African-American community. But as Tim Wise said in my home, good to see you, Tim, he's also speaking to that alt-right. It's a coded message, because embedded in you have no jobs and no schools, you have nothing going on, is also promoting this pathology that we're failures, we can't be successful, and we're nothing.
And Tim, I want to give you the last word on this, because I have had this question of why it does seem that some of the sort of more traditional Republicans, white Republicans, are comfortable being in coalition with people like the alt-right. How can a message to both of those communities kind of work on them equally, and how are they comfortable in the same coalition?
Well, I mean, it's the same thing that propelled David Duke to 55 to 60% of the white vote in Louisiana in 90 and 91. To his hardcore base, he spoke one way to remind them that he was the guy who was going to get tough with black folks. And to the folks he was trying to woo, he said, well, I'm not really a racist anymore. I used to be a racist. He talked in code. That's been the game on the right for a long time, this mix between what Ian Haney Lopez calls dog whistle politics and what Trump has really done, which has been more of a bullhorn. But notice, every solution he has for people of color, quote unquote, and the problems are authoritarian and racist. It is to kick Mexican folk and Mexican American folk out of the country and immigrants out. It is to block Muslim folks, many of whom mostly disproportionately people of color, keep them out of the country, and for black folks to control them with cops and so-called law and order. That is why it is accurate to say that his policies are institutionally racist, regardless of his own heart. People say, well, do you think Donald Trump's racist? Here's the thing. I don't know. It's like asking if a drug dealer also uses their own drugs and is an addict. I don't know if he gets high on his own supply, but I know what he's selling, and that's very obvious.
All right, getting that Biggie Smalls reference in. You win, Tim Wise. All right, my guests are going to stick around. I think we're going to keep Tim around for tomorrow, too, for that reference. All right, coming up in our next hour, Ted Cruz jumps on the Trump train just in time for the first debate. I wonder how his wife and his dad, who were dissed by Donald Trump, feel about that. More AM Joy straight ahead.